He never commanded an army. He never ruled a kingdom. And yet, his ideas reshaped how rulers think about power. Niccolò Machiavelli did not conquer cities. He dissected ambition, and in doing so, he altered the moral vocabulary of leadership. But ideas, like power, rarely remain confined to their original intent. They travel, they evolve. They are interpreted by people, with their own ambitions, and once detached from restraint, they can justify almost anything. Niccolò Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469. Florence at the time was one of the most vibrant cities in Europe, a center of art, commerce, and intellectual life. But beneath its beauty was constant political instability. Florence was technically a republic, yet power shifted frequently between influential families, factions, and temporary alliances. The Medici family, wealthy bankers with enormous influence, had dominated Florentine politics for decades. But their control was never absolute. Political power in Florence was fluid. Governments rose and collapsed quickly. Alliances formed and dissolved. Public loyalty was rarely permanent. It was within this environment that Machiavelli grew up, watching a political system where survival often mattered more than principle, where stability depended not on virtue, but on calculation. Machiavelli was not born into great wealth or aristocracy. His family belonged to Florence's educated middle class. They valued learning, and Machiavelli developed an early fascination with history and classical literature. He read extensively about ancient Rome, about republics, about power, about the rise and fall of political systems. These studies would later shape much of his thinking. In 1498, Machiavelli entered public service in Florence. He became a diplomat and civil servant for the Florentine Republic. This role allowed him to travel across Europe and observe political power firsthand. He visited royal courts, negotiated with foreign leaders, studied how rulers maintained authority. He met figures such as King Louis XII of France, and perhaps most famously, Cesare Borgia. Borgia was the ambitious son of Pope Alexander VI, a man known for his ruthless political maneuvering. Where others saw brutality, Machiavelli saw strategy. Borgia's ability to consolidate power quickly fascinated him. He studied his methods closely, how he neutralized rivals, how he created fear, how he stabilized newly conquered territories. Machiavelli did not romanticize these actions. He analyzed them as if power itself were a system that could be understood, and perhaps even predicted. But Machiavelli's career in government did not last forever. Florence's political landscape changed once again. In 1512, the powerful Medici family returned to power. The Florentine Republic collapsed. Officials associated with the previous government were removed. Machiavelli was one of them. He was accused of involvement in a conspiracy against the Medici regime. Arrested, imprisoned, interrogated, tortured, for a man who had spent years studying power from the inside. Losing it so suddenly was devastating. Eventually, Machiavelli was released, but he was exiled from political life. He was forced to retreat to the countryside, outside Florence, a dramatic fall from influence. Stripped of office, separated from the world of politics he had studied so closely. But exile gave him something else: time and distance. In this period, Machiavelli began writing his most famous work, not poetry, not philosophical speculation, but analysis. The result was The Prince. The book was short, direct, almost clinical in tone. Rather than describing ideal rulers, Machiavelli focused on effective ones. He asked a simple question: how does a leader acquire power and keep it? In a world defined by instability, his answers were unsettling. Virtue alone, he argued, was not enough. A ruler must understand fear, must understand perception, must be willing to act decisively when circumstances demand it. Love from the public could be valuable, but love is fragile. Fear, Machiavelli suggested, could sometimes be more reliable. He did not argue that cruelty should be constant, but he argued that decisive action, even harsh action, might sometimes be necessary to preserve order. The argument shocked many readers, because it separated political survival from moral perfection. For centuries, political philosophy had often described how rulers should behave. Machiavelli instead described how they actually behaved. This distinction was revolutionary, but it was also dangerous, because describing ruthless strategy can easily be interpreted as endorsing it. Machiavelli himself was more complex than the reputation that later surrounded him. He admired republics. He believed strong institutions were essential for political stability. In other writings, he praised civic participation and public virtue. But the prince overshadowed much of his broader work because it confronted something uncomfortable. Power does not always reward goodness. History, Machiavelli argued, often favors adaptability. Leaders who cling too rigidly to ideal behavior may lose control, while those who adjust to circumstances may survive. Over time, Machiavelli's name became synonymous with manipulation. The word Machiavellian entered language as a description of cunning, deceptive strategy. But this interpretation simplified his ideas. Machiavelli was not celebrating cruelty for its own sake. He was examining political reality as he had observed it. A reality shaped by betrayal, fragile alliances, and sudden shifts in fortune. Yet ideas do not remain controlled by their authors. Once written, they travel, they are interpreted, sometimes misunderstood, sometimes intentionally distorted. Across centuries, rulers, politicians, and strategists studied Machiavelli's ideas. Some saw them as warnings, others saw them as instruction. His concepts influenced discussions of statecraft across Europe and eventually beyond it. Ideas such as pragmatic governance, strategic deception, the careful management of public image. These ideas became part of modern political vocabulary. Realpolitik emerged as a way of thinking about politics, focused on practical outcomes rather than moral ideals. In this sense, Machiavelli helped redefine how power could be discussed. He made it acceptable to analyze leadership in pragmatic terms. But pragmatism without ethical limits carries its own risks, because once leaders believe that success alone determines legitimacy, moral boundaries begin to blur. Cruelty can be framed as necessity, manipulation can be described as strategy, and ambition can disguise itself as responsibility. Machiavelli himself never returned to high political office. Despite dedicating the prince to the Medici family, hoping to regain favor, his political career never fully recovered. He continued writing history and political commentary, but the influence he once held within government was gone. When he died in 1527, he was not widely celebrated. His reputation would evolve slowly over centuries, often criticized, often misunderstood, yet endlessly debated. His work forced readers to confront uncomfortable truths about political systems. That good intentions alone rarely secure stability. That appearances often shape public perception more than private virtue. That leaders must sometimes make decisions in morally ambiguous situations. But Machiavelli also revealed something deeper. Power is not only about authority, it is about perception, about timing, about understanding human behavior. People fear instability, they desire order, and leaders who promise order can attract loyalty, even when their methods are harsh. This insight remains relevant today, because the relationship between morality and power continues to challenge societies. Should leaders always follow strict ethical principles? Or should they adapt to circumstances in order to maintain stability? Machiavelli did not offer simple answers. He offered analysis, observation, and the uncomfortable recognition that political reality is rarely pure. Niccolò Machiavelli changed the conversation about power. He stripped away illusion, removed sentiment, focused on outcomes rather than intentions. In doing so, he provided clarity. But clarity without conscience is powerful and dangerous. Power does not require cruelty, but cruelty often finds justification in power. Machiavelli showed rulers how the world works. What they chose to do with that knowledge was never entirely his responsibility. But once ideas enter the world, they no longer belong to their author.